Okay, everyone, welcome back to the Contrarians. Today's show is going to be interesting. Hopefully, they all are. But today we're doing defending the 80s against the 70s. And while I have some guesses as to which decade our various panelists are going to be defending, I'll be interested to see which of us end up being the Contrarians in this. So I know I'm going to be defending the 80s. We'll see who all joins me in that. So this is kind of a very open topic, lots of room for discussion. So let's go around in how it shows up on my screen. And that means, Peter, you're going to be our first.
Excellent. Good to see everybody. Hello. Happy Sunday as we are filming this. Sure. The instant presumption is, as the old guy here, that the 70s are it for me. And, everything else is downhill. But I'm going to come at this a little bit differently. So, Your Honor, you may have to qualify me as a hostile witness. Look, they're very different decades. And the thing about them is that you can choose the decade completely dependent on what it is you prefer and what it is you like, because each of them offers something so singular, unique, that the other one doesn't have, that makes them special. So as a lover of the 70s, I grew up during that period. I think the attributes that I look at in the 70s that are kind of hard to match, in my opinion, is a whole collection of things. First, it's the diversity of it. We look at a decade that has literally almost every genre or style of music that at one point or another came in and out of the decade. Just a quick snapshot, and I'm not really a labels guy, but for the sake of a discussion, rock, pop, soul, R&B, funk, fusion, progressive, punk, dance, disco, acoustic music, singer, songwriter. If you're looking for that, there's some of that in the 70s for you. And not only is it there, many would say, and I tend to be one of them, that the best of those types of genres were being done in the 70s. The fact that they could coexist and you could listen to the radio, and one of the things we loved doing is on New Year's Eve, we would listen and tape from the radio the year-end countdown, and we'd just keep changing cassette tapes as fast as we could to collect as many songs as we could that had been on the radio that year. But the diversity was crazy. You could go from Carole King to Jethro Tull to Cat Stevens to James Taylor to, Alice Cooper and everything in between. And so from that standpoint, the creativity that is present in the 70s is really kind of hard to match. And again, these are my opinions. But there's also other things. As a musician, I've now been able to look back at it, and I think there were some things in the 70s that have slowly died off and are no longer present in music, and that's sad. I look at how they were recorded. I look at how songs were arranged. I look at how they were performed. One of the things I will suggest is that the 70s was the last decade, and I would say it's kind of an epitaph to the bass player. Bass players in the 70s were it for me. They were the foundation of so much of this great music. They were high in the mix. You had no trouble. And usually they were either the second or third most prominent instrument in the recording. They drove the groove. They drove the feel. Guitar, while important in heavier bands, let's say like Alice or Zeppelin or the Guess Who, bands like that had guitar. But listen to Alice. Listen to School's Out. Listen to those. Dunaway's bass is driving that song. The guitar is more supportive. And that clearly changes as we get into the new decade. So that, from especially as a rhythm mate, the drummer seeing the kind of the demise of the bass player is a sad thing, because I think it really makes a big difference on how a song feels and how it's presented. We've lost a lot of the heavier orchestration. We listen back to all these songs that we used to listen to, Temptations, all these other bands, and we just took it for granted. Stevie Wonder, all this stuff that went back that had strings and horns, these big, lush, gorgeous arrangements. And those have died off. Now, obviously, cost and all that other stuff was part of it. The whole mentality that you could do like the Wrecking Crew, where you had a standing orchestration and an arranger and all that kind of stuff there to take a song or something and make it orchestrated like that. It became much more stripped down in the 80s. I miss that because I think it really enhanced a lot of songs and really gave it a fullness. Doesn't need to be on everything. Obviously, a lot of bands didn't use it, but when they did, it really made an impact for me, and I thought it was really, really great. The songs I thought were a little deeper, not overtly from a thinking standpoint, but they weren't as overall cringy as they kind of became in the 80s, and that's genre specific. Let me make sure we're clear on that. It started to get, you could take your G and your PG rating and you could kind of see where the lyrics were going in a lot of bands, and it changed quite a bit from the focus of the 80s. There's a lot of carryover, and Reed and I were talking before we started filming, and he was dead correct in this point. There is a lot of carryover. The early 70s still has a lot of elements from the late 60s. The early 80s has a lot of elements from the late 70s. It's not you hit 1979, hit checkpoint Charlie and go, okay, if you'd like to jump into the 80s, please go through the gate and leave everything behind. It didn't work like that. So there are all elements that carry over. So it takes a couple years for that decade to fully shift. And when we talk about the 80s, that's what happened. Now, the 80s, to me, are a very strong decade. The emergence of a real strong pop element, great simple melodies, but you start to get into a lot of different things. The synthesizer starts to take over. The bass player starts to fall away. Keyboards now start taking the bass parts. Drum machines and emulators and those types of things start to replace a lot of live drumming. But there's a lot of great melodies and there's a lot of great catchy stuff. And we also then move into, if you're a hard rock and or / metal fan, it's kind of hard to argue with what happens in the 80s. A lot of these are legacy bands, and we can make the argue of which one belongs where. Michael Jackson's biggest albums were in the 80s, but he's a 70s artist. So where's the crossover? Who do you give credit to? Do you say the 70s because that's when he started, or do you do it when the album actually came out? Because that's now a product of the times, of the styles, and popularity obviously made it what it was. Back in Black is 80, but that's kind of its release. All of the music was recorded in 79, and a lot of it was kind of even pre-written before the passing of Bond. So you can say, where does it belong? Who gets credit? Who gets to claim it? Because if you move Thriller and Back in Black over into the 70s, and I'm not a big sales guy because I don't think numbers mean anything other than popularity, it's going to be really hard to argue the top 10 all-time albums not being very heavily focused in the 70s, because they are. That's where the big batch of the most selling albums is. I like both decades, but if I have to preference and I have to just pick one, I'm going to take the 70s all the time for the variation and the diversity and the musicianship. It's more my liking. Obviously, I grew up with it, but so yeah, I'm gonna pick the 70s. So that's where I'm gonna sit, and I'll stay there and defend if I need to.
Beautiful, man. That was really
all
cool.
right.
Thank you.
So one vote for the 70s. Martin, you're next on my screen. Are you defending the 80s or are you championing the 70s?
I'm going to champion the 70s. I'll agree with some things Peter said. He brought up some great points, and I want to disagree with something as well. So to kick off right off the bat, this strikes me as kind of an important distinction. I think there's more diversity in the 80s simply because every genre that has been around is still around, and there's new ones coming all the time. And I, as I always joke when people talk about, oh, you left this out of your 70s review book or your 80s review book, your 90s review book, I usually say, you know what? I left 10 things out of the 70s book. I left 100 things out of the 80s book. And I left 1,000 things out of the 90s book. And I left 10,000 things out of the 2000s book because there's an exponential increase in all albums. So diversity, I think, just mathematically, and the fact that, new subgenres blossom all the time. There's more diversity in the 80s, I think, just sort of logically from a math point of view. But the interesting thing that's a bit of a twist on and an agreement with Peter is that one of the problems I have with the 80s is that on the 70s, you could actually have more diversity right on the same record because there's so much fewer of the rules have been written at this point. And I'll use as an example, I always bring this up. Just even the difference between Black Sabbath Never Say Die and Black Sabbath Heaven and Hell, right? So I always say Heaven and Hell, they're self-aware, they're obvious, it's a little straightforward. Martin Birch's arrangements are basically guitar, bass, and drums throughout. But Never Say Die had Breakout and Air Dance and Johnny Blade with the the snare thing and the little blurps and bleeps of synthesizers and the weird Never Say Die song, right? This punky fast song kind of thing. So and even more so on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath or Sabotage ad infinitum Led Zeppelin albums. So I think you got a lot of diversity because there's just less going on and less rules, and there's just kind of a bigger spirit of creativity. I think that gets constricted, and I use that term self-aware, right? It's like Sabbath becomes aware of what genre they operate in. The walls are closing in. It's a heavy metal genre. There's more pressure. There's more industry stuff saying there's lots and lots and lots of records out there. You're still going to compete with 50 records, but they're all going to be heavy metal records this time. You're no longer competing with the Allman Brothers and Yes and Gentle Giant and Fleetwood Mac, right? You're now competing with a basket of heavy metal albums, right? So there's more diversity because there's an exponential. Say there were 20 genres in the 70s. Now there's 200 genres, right? Now the other point I wanted to make is just that I think the 70s win from a production point of view overall. And one of the quips an old guy like me would say, they call it classic rock for a reason, right? That whole thing, right? So I think the point is that I'd say whatever, half, just a broad generalization, but half the records in the 80s are recorded like the 70s, right? And those are the ones that remain timeless, right? So High and Dry and On Through the Night are timeless productions. Not so much Hysteria and Adrenalize, right? So I think what happens is the productions of the 70s so far, and this could change, right? I mean, and it does in dance music cults and things of today's era where they look at the 80s and there's brilliant productions that they love and all that. We're operating kind of in a different world. I think in our world, as of yet, 40 years later, 80s productions, all the vagaries that Peter talked about have remained dated sounding and not preferable, yet every record recorded like a 70s record, say all the REM catalog, anything folk rock or analogy from a creative point of view, is recorded essentially like a 70s album, and it still doesn't sound, and it doesn't sound dated now, even though it might have been the late 80s. But just like all those 70s albums, no one complains about 70s albums sounding dated from a production point of view, right? They might say other things about it, but not from a production point of view. So I think the most objective thing you can say in defense of the 70s is that it turns out that the decisions they made about, and I love your point, Peter, about the bass players too. That's amazing. So that's part of this production melange too. But I think we can agree from an objective point of view that it turns out they recorded albums a pretty cool way, and it became timeless. And half the albums from the 90s are recorded like 70s albums, half the albums from the 80s, half the albums from the 2000s, maybe even more now, unless you're a full-on electronic band of some sort. But basically every record, tons and tons of guitar, bass, and drums and piano records, all what they learned from, say, Dark Side of the Moon forward to the end of the 70s. They're still doing it. They still want that sound, whether it's done a different way or not. They're still going for that sound. Let me just check here. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Yeah, again, that self-awareness thing is a big thing. So Never Say Die to Heaven and Hell, Hellbent for Leather 79 to Ram It Down in 89, right? I mean, it's just very, very self-aware that this is who we are and this is what we're supposed to be. But there was still a magic, it was still the wild frontier in the 70s, that there was tons and tons of creativity. And again, the diversity, what I find super impressive is the diversity all over the same album kind of thing. So there's my point. So I won't defend it. I'll be 70s.
Well,
okay.
I'm sorry to jump in. You nailed it, Martin. And I think the current bands kind of use it as a badge of honor. When they use terms like we're going old school or we're going throwback.
Oh, I went and bought a Leslie cabinet. I got a Hammond. Oh, look at my new Mellotron, right?
Exactly. Yeah, your
those
point
things
is
are all 60s.
Right.
Well, but that was the carryover into the 70s that I was talking about. But that you're just absolutely spot on with that.
Yeah.
Right. Although the 80s are coming up. We'll talk about that. John the Music Nut, based on some comments you were making on the Patreon, I think I know which way you're going, but let's hear it.
Yes, I'm the youngest guy on this panel, but I am a 70s guy. No doubt about it. Let me name some bands for you. America, Bachman Turner Overdrive, Casey and the Sunshine Band, Stevie Wonder, Donny Osmond. You would hear them consecutively on the radio in the 70s. No one blinked an eye. It was about the variety, as Peter was saying. The variety was so great then. Yes, there were more genres in the 80s, but you didn't hear a lot of those genres anymore in the 80s on the radio. Think of Southern rock. You didn't hear Southern rock on the radio in the 80s anymore, or it got watered down. Or the best bands had either broken up from that genre or were on hiatus. You had jazz fusion in the 70s. You had this wonderful music, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Herbie Hancock's Headhunters, Weather Report. What happens in the 80s? We get Kenny G. Everything's getting dumbed down, watered down. You talk about the bands that made their name in the 70s and are coming back in the 80s. Cheap Trick in the 70s, they were becoming a power pop force. They have their down period. They come back with the flame in the 80s. Are those albums from the late 80s, and I'm going in the early 90s, are they as memorable? No, because they fit out of formula now. Now it's, okay, let's just sound like similar bands from the day. Let's get a power ballad. Let's get in some professional songwriters. And let's do a cover song too while we're at it. That is so much the 80s for the 70s artists. I think a lot of the best music that came out of the 80s came from college radio. REM built their way up through college radio. U2, The Cure, The Smiths built their way up from college radio. Metallica, Megadeth. I heard these bands before they made it on these college radio stations that would have a 3-hour metal show on Saturdays or a 5-hour metal show on Monday nights. So it all came from the underground. It either came from the underground. There were bands that hit their stride in the late 70s and arguably made their best stuff in the early to mid 80s. Van Halen, The Police, Talking Heads. And here's the thing about the 70s that I clearly think is better: the craftsmanship. It was all about the song. In the 80s, it became the song, but more so the video. We're not listening to radio anymore if you're growing up in the 80s. And I grew up in the 80s. You're watching MTV. And they're playing the same videos over and over again. And it's like, oh, did you see it became, did you hear the latest song? Or did you see the newest video? And that's where the money was being invested. In the 70s, I've said this song and verse on so many shows like this. The record labels treated their bands like assets. They work with them, finding their sound. If that happened, if the artists from the record labels from the 80s and the 90s were around the 70s, we wouldn't get Rush, because what would happen is they get 2 albums, they didn't sell, we're going to drop them. Judas Priest, same thing. Scorpions, same thing. They work with the artists. The Scorpions had several albums before they made a dent in the US in 79 with Love Drive. That wouldn't have happened in the 80s, because if they didn't, after 2 albums, they would have dropped. If the albums didn't chart, they would have dropped them. They worked with them in these 70s. They might have given them a 4-album deal. With Rush, what I've always read was the 4th album. They got to make it on the 4th album. We got to make 2112 the album, the big album that's going to cross over. It charted at number 61, not a high chart placement, but it had legs. It kept selling and selling, and then they built off of that. We had punk in the 70s. It was the remnants, maybe the late 60s, but the Ramones, the Clash, the Jam, the Stranglers, the Damned, 70s. That music is aged like a fine wine to me. We were talking about the recordings and the production. Yes. When you hear a lot of songs from the 80s, you hear those loud shrieking keyboards. Martin, I know you've talked about this with Heart. There's those loud shrieking keyboards on those 80s albums, and they scream 80s. But then you hear something like Barracuda or Magic Man or Straight On from the 70s, and they sound fresh, even though they were recorded earlier. So to me, and we're talking about variety, you had Steely Dan getting played on the radio in the 70s. You had Earth, Wind, and Fire getting played. You had War getting played. Would they get played in the 80s? Probably not. Bachman Turner Overdrive, would they get played? Probably not, because of the visual. We got to make the great video, and they look like a bunch of regular guys, right? Earth, Wind, and Fire went in all different directions with their music. They wrote great singles, but musically, they were another level. Look at a band like Chicago. 70s, you still hear those great songs all the time. 80s, there's a few that still resonate with you because they were well written. They hook up with David Foster, and now it just sounds like David Foster. And the songs are interchangeable. Yes, they're having hits, but how many of those hits do you still remember? Where the 70s, Chicago, you remember all those songs, and they still sound timeless. They still sound great. Last point. How's the 80s, some of the record company decisions hurt some bands? I'm going back to the 60s now. Jefferson Airplane, made some great records in the late 60s. They gave us 2 big hits, Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, and a lot of other classic songs. And then eventually their Jefferson Starship, watered down, still good. The hits are Marty Ballin ballads, and the 80s are just Starship. And then yet we built this city on rock and roll, which was a #1 song. You listen to it now, you're like, ugh, I just heard it 20 minutes ago. And I get the same reaction now than I did when I was 15 or 14 when that song came out. It's just best stuff in the 80s. Best stuff in the 80s came out of college radio. Or the late 80s, you had bands like Jane's Addiction and Fishbone and Faith No More. They were getting their groove on, and then they do some great work. Some of them did some great work in the 90s as well. So, and I think the 90s was better than the 80s too. I'll just leave it at that. All right. That's my point. Thanks.
Nice. Very cool, John.
Thank you.
Okay. So we know who's going to have the contrarian opinion then. All right, Parish, where do you fall on this?
Well, I'm actually on the 80s. So I will start by saying I do love the 70s. I mean, it's not surprising. I started my love of music in the early sort of around 72, 73, grew all the way through that, and I absolutely love the 70s. But actually, when I analyze it, and it's funny really, because I was talking about 3-4 weeks ago with a friend at work, Tom, and he's 10 years younger than me, so he's absolutely about the 80s, and we're having a bit of debate at lunchtime over which was better, and I was telling him actually it was the 70s. And he accused me of having an unbiased, what's it, an unconscious bias towards the 70s, because that was kind of where I started. And actually, the more I spoke, the more I kind of convinced myself, I think he was actually right. I actually probably do prefer the 80s. So what I'm going to present here is actually why I convinced myself that actually I think I prefer the 80s. So my starting point is about, as I grew through the 70s, I loved glam rock, I loved classic rock, I loved punk, new wave. But the first musical genre that I felt was mine, that I was there right from the beginning, and even to this day, I still think is the best musical genre, is new wave of heavy metal, British heavy metal. So that's 1980 to 1983. And I just lapped that all up. So, I mean, I've got them here to show and tell. First what they called Soundhouse tapes from Iron Maiden, early Diamond Head, early Girl, Angel Witch, Def Leppard, Iron Maiden again. So I lived through all of that. I lived through it from the time of buying the albums and the singles when they came out, buying them when they were on, when the first singles came out on independence. I saw them live. We were lucky that we had a couple of venues near us where all of the new wave of heavy metal bands played. The big four, as they were considered then: Iron Maiden, Saxon, Def Leppard, and bizarrely Girl, which nobody ever talks about now, but back then we thought they were one of the big four. The middle range ones like Angel Witch and Samson and Tigers of Pang Tang, Girl School, but even the obscure ones with the strange names like Ethel the Frog and Toad the Wet Sprocket and the EF Band. So I lapped that all up, saw them all live. And even now, some of my favourite bands are Saxon, Iron Maiden, Def Leppard. Girl School released a fantastic album last year. Tigers of Pang Tang released a fantastic album from last year. So for me, the first sort of musical genre that I felt was mine, that I grew up and lived and breathed all the way through, was new wave and British heavy metal. So that's, if you like, that's the first case for the 80s for me. The second is, when I look at my top 20 favourite albums of all time, they break down as follows: 7 from the 70s, 9 from the 80s, and 5 from the 2000s. I haven't got any from the 90s, as it happens. So the bulk of the albums, the biggest, almost half of the albums that I actually like best in my top 20 is from the 80s. And most of them are classic ones like Overkill, or I really like Pyromania. I like Back in Black. So some of the classics, but I also like some more obscure ones like, well, obscure to me in the UK. I like Scarecrow by John Mellencamp. I think that's a really good album. I like Jimmy Barnes, Working Class Man. I think that's a great album. I know lots of people don't like hair metal, but I think Long Cold Winter by Cinderella is a really good rock album. And Giant, which was a sort of a late 80s AOR band, their first album I think is a really good one. And I know, despite the fact I argued against it on a recent show, I actually really like the first Damn Yankees album as well. So if I take those 90s out, those 80 albums, there's 9 of those. If I look at the 70s, again, lots of them are classic rock. So I've got Queen, Night at the Opera. I've got Out of the Blue ELO. I've got Tonic for the Troops by Boomtown Rats. What else have I got? The strange thing is 4 of my 7 are actually from 79. So I've taken the view that the line is the line. So the 1st of January 80 onwards is the 80s, and anything that's up to the 31st of December 79 is the 70s. But 4 of my favourite albums of all time come from 79. So that's Dream Police, Highway to Hell. What else have I got? Tonic for the Troops. Oh, and Overkill, that was 79 as well. So very nearly the 80s, but then you could say quite a lot of what I like for the 80s is very early 80s. So you could say that almost So if I was really looking at it, I'd probably take 78 through to 84 as my favourite period, and it straddles both. But nonetheless, I can't, because that's not the basis of the show. So if I was taking it on that 1st of January 1980 line, then the majority of albums. And I've got a few other examples of things that come out. So my favourite single of all time, Going Underground by the Jam. Now, that came out in 1980, probably recorded in 1979, but came out in 1980. So for me, 1980. My favourite debut album of all time, and I love a lot of 70s debuts, is the very first Motley Crue album. And I mean the very first. So that's the Leather Records version. I don't particularly like the Elektra remix and redone, but that first version I just think is a brilliant pop rock quasi. I mean, it's very similar to sort of Cheap Trick around that time. It's got sweet undertones. So my favourite live album of all time, which will come as no surprise to Martin, is a Slade on stage. And I, despite the fact I love lots of 70s live albums, that's my favourite. And just as an aside, that's also my most hated album cover of all time. I mean, why do you have an album called Slade on Stage and have them sitting on the road? And then the back is them standing above a road as well. So if it was called Slade on the Road, maybe I wouldn't have liked the album cover, but it might have made a bit more sense. But so if you ever do your most hated album covers on your Wednesday shows, that would be my contribution. So that's kind of why I would support the 80s. I've got a couple of, I'd like to respond to a couple of comments that have been made by others. I mean, I don't think the bass guitar did disappear in the 80s. I mean, you listen to Level 42, listen to Duran Duran, listen to David Bowie on Let's Dance. Even though I don't particularly like the song, the bass playing on Kajakugu's Too Shy is a phenomenal bass line. So I don't think, it may have moved out of rock into other musical styles, but I don't think bass just disappeared. So that would be the first thing. And then the other point is, the thing I have a problem with the early 70s, and I have a line with the early 70s for one thing and one thing only. I just can't stand the Hammond organ. I just don't like it. It just reminds me of sitting on the beach, listening to the organ playing on the pier, going to the pantomimes at Christmas. That's probably why I like a lot of live versions of the studio albums on the early 70s, because a lot of those don't have that same Hammond organ. I just don't like the Hammond organ. So the synthesizer coming in and replacing the Hammond organ, to me, is a good thing. So it all comes down to choice and taste, I guess, for these things. But so it's me, my personal view. I love the 70s, but my personal view is I prefer the 80s.
Very nice, Parish.
Okay. Well, I've got some notes. I've been making some notes because as I keep saying, my memory is Swiss cheese. So I didn't mute myself, did I? Okay, good. Got a lot to cover here, so let's try and keep this semi-organized. First, I am going to defend the 80s. And let's start with just the idea that you cannot separate the decade from the music. The environment is always going to affect the artists. That's just how art works. The 70s were a depressing-ass decade. And because of that, I mean, it was bad in the US, it was bad in Britain, it was bad in a lot of places, and because of that, you had some really downer music produced. The 80s, rightly or wrongly in hindsight, were a much more optimistic period, and it produced happier music. It produced a lot more up-tempo. You didn't get these real down-tempo. You know, you think about all the Birmingham bands and the terrible environment that they grew up in and how that created heavy metal, versus the LA party scene and the kind of music that created, which is much more up-tempo and people talking about, they're not talking about, you know, the Vietnam War anymore. They're talking about sex and drugs because they don't have a war to fight in 1980 or 82, 83. So the decade was just a more optimistic time. especially in comparison to the 70s. Now, when I look at, let's talk about productions for a minute. Yes, the 70s produced timeless production, but to me, I was very young in the 70s, but I was a very casual music fan. Whenever it was on the radio, I had an uncle that had a huge 8-track collection that he gave me. I had a couple of friends who listened to music, but I didn't seek out any particular music, so I just absorbed whatever was around. And as a result, it's all kind of homogenous. There's that 70s production, nothing stands out to me about it. It sounds generally good. But what I remember most about the 70s is how crappy studio albums were compared to live albums. You would listen to a live album and go, oh, this is fantastic. Listen to how heavy it is. Listen to the vocalist is way out front. The guitars are way out front. And then you listen to the studio album and you're like, they cut the balls off of this. It's weak. It's underproduced. It's because it's designed to be played on AM radio, which doesn't have a lot of available bandwidth. They're taking a lot of the music out of the music. So if you want to really experience the 70s music, you get the live album. And this is where the really high-selling live albums come from, is the 70s. You know, Cheap Trick's version of I Want You to Want Me on Live at Budokan is great. I think the studio track sucks. The first time I heard it, I was like, what is this? This is the weakest T version of this song ever. You get to the 80s, production has come far enough that studio albums and live albums are really pretty comparable. So you can get something like the Scorpions live, and it sounds very much like a Scorpion studio album. It sounds like a Love at First Sting or something like that. Let's see here. And this, of course, is going to be my perspective. I'm a heavy music aficionado, branching into other genres now. And of course, growing up in small town America. So these are important things to keep in mind as I go through this. Because now John was talking about MTV earlier. To me, MTV is a huge net positive for the 80s over the 70s. Now, I know that Britain had music videos prior to that, but the US didn't. There was no mass distribution network for that sort of thing. Now, you also have to kind of draw a line about 86, 87, because one of the things that maybe is not great about the 80s is marketing becomes such a science in the 80s. In the 70s, it's very scattershot. They just kind of throw it against the wall and see what sticks. But in the 80s, marketing becomes this razor-edged thing that they find out what people like, and then they give it to you, and they hold back the things that aren't going to sell because they need to feed their cocaine habits. So MTV exposed me as a small town guy to all kinds of music I never would have heard. I don't care if radio or not. There was no rock radio in Lewistown, Montana. You got the Farming Report, and there was a country radio station, and there was a Christian radio station. There's no rock radio station. If I wanted rock, I went to MTV. And in the early years, MTV played everything because they needed the content. And you can say, oh, they didn't play much heavy metal. I don't care if it was much or not. I discovered every heavy metal band I loved in the 80s through MTV because I saw a video. Maybe it was on Headbangers Ball. I caught the video for Dio's Last in Line like at 1:30 in the morning one time. But I was hooked from the opening, and that the videos made those songs so much more powerful. It sticks in your mind. You've got a visual to go with the song now. That was an incredible marketing tool. Technology. Now, technology obviously is the relentless progression of technology. You get positives and negatives. You can say, well, the drum machine came into its own in the 80s. Many people hate that. I'm going to go contrarian and say one of my favorite ZZ Top albums is still Eliminator, and it's because it has that relentless clockwork beat on behind those songs. That was a big part of the music, and it hit just the perfect sweet spot. Now, I know synthesizers are taking over, but synthesizers have been around for a long time. What's more important than synthesizers, in my opinion, are sequencers.
Right.
Sequencers had not existed until the 80s because the computer tech just wasn't there. And those early sequencers only held like 8K of memory. So you have all of these songs that are, in fact, more creative because you're talking about people that are taking a brand new tool and using it in ways that are very restricted by the technology and then coming up with ways to make music with it. As opposed to the 70s, where people have been playing guitar for a long, long time. People have been playing bass for a long, long time. You know, rock and roll had been around for 20 years in the 70s, well, by the mid 70s. So you've got people learning to make music with new technology, and you get MIDI. The musical instrument digital interface comes out in the 80s. It's the biggest production improvement in the history of production. Nothing before or after has had the impact that MIDI has. And if you're not familiar with MIDI, that is a way that you can synchronize things through digital interface. Whereas if you think about it before, if your guitar player is playing something and he's got an echo machine with 30 milliseconds of echo on it, and he does 2 takes, and then the engineer goes, oh, that second take didn't go, we need to do it again. They have to go in and figure out how to sync that up so that his echo is not out of time with the previous recording. And that was nearly impossible. With MIDI, it became very doable. You sync everything to a clock and you just connect it right up. This made production faster, not less expensive. People were blowing millions and millions of dollars, but it meant that it was there were less expensive labels able to produce bands. And this is where you get Metal Blade and Megaforce. Those could not have existed in the US in the 70s. I know that in England and in the UK, there were poverty record companies, but there wasn't really that in the US. So that is why we get all of these genres, because now the barrier for entry is lower. You would never have had thrash music in the 70s. Not just because taste had changed, but because the money to technology ratio had not changed enough to make that possible. Also, going with this idea of variety, Martin's right that you get the exponentially more variety. Now, again, you can think of this as a good thing or a bad thing, but where Parish is saying that he was really into the new wave of British heavy metal, for me it was thrash, although I was, well into my teen years when thrash became a thing. But the fact is, genres exist because we as people like to compartmentalize things. We like to be able to say, I want that. I want my tacos to have, or I want my wings to have a particular sauce, right? I don't want the death sauce. I want the red hot sauce on my wings. And that's how we apply it to music as well. If I went into a record and they had a thrash section, I would go, oh, okay, I can just go here to the thrash section. Whereas before, if you're going to look at records, it's all of rock. Your Black Sabbath and your Status Quo and your Fleetwood Mac is all in the same thing, and you're looking through hundreds and hundreds of albums. Again, you may consider that a negative, but as somebody who is just getting into a musical genre and going, oh, this is what I like, and just as importantly, it allows you to avoid what you don't like. I never liked death metal. I eventually made peace with death metal, but I still don't really like it because of the vocals. The vocalist was always my favorite thing in music. So I could, oh, this is death metal? Well, I'm not even going to give that a try. And there's a lot of music I missed out on in the 80s because I knew it was in a genre that I didn't care for. Now, this is where you get that, that laser-focused marketing as the decade goes on. And I think it's about 85, 86 is really where the flipping point is. By the time you get to 87, it's all the hits all the time, period. You're going to get the hits on the radio. You're going to get the hits on MTV. Aerosmith is a pop band now. Whitesnake is a pop band. Everybody is more image conscious. That was one thing MTV did. But as a kid, certainly that was not a negative to me, because to me, everybody from the 70s was just a dirty old hippie. You look at Deep Purple, you look at Black Sabbath, you look at Status Quo. These guys look like they woke up in 1974 not realizing that the 60s had ended and they were just going to go on with their music careers. In the 80s, everyone's very image conscious. The bands start looking better. Now, let's go back to technology. The things that produced the sound made huge leaps in the 1980s. In addition to sequencers and MIDI, let's talk about guitars. Let's talk about custom guitars. The 80s were the year of custom guitars. In the 70s, if you didn't want to play Fender or Gibson, BC Rich was pretty much it. And BC Rich had cool shapes. Derringer was a big proponent of BC Rich. He played the Mockingbird, and they had the Seagull and these other interesting shapes. But that was it. Once you get into the 80s, now you've got Charvel and Jackson, and people have these wild paint jobs. Active pickups become a thing. Because believe it or not, there was a time when you could get electrocuted nearly to death by playing in a venue that had very poorly grounded electricity. The U.S. did not used to require buildings to ground their electricity. So your electricity going up into your amplifier, down through your guitar cable and into your guitar, you could, if you held two different things, your guitar strings, by the way, the player is the ground on a guitar. If you don't know electronics, if you're a guitar player, you are the ground on your guitar. And then you grab another electric thing like a microphone, people got literally electrocuted. That happened many times. So they invented active pickups. One of the things it did was it didn't have a ground. And it became really powerful. Everybody loved the sound of it. The JCM 800, the amplifier that makes heavy music in the 1980s, and everything after that comes out in the 1980s, along with the Soldano SLO 100. So later in the 80s, we get the solid state technology is moving up and moving into the musical sphere. And we get the ADA MP1 preamp. Every heavy metal band in thrash played an ADA MP1 preamp. Alex Skolnick played two in Testament, one into the other, which is why his tone is loud and screechy on those early albums. And let's not forget, in the 1980s, music is more popular than ever. That's why they have to invent the diamond certification in the 1980s. Now, Peter's right. If you go to the list of best-selling albums, the best-selling albums, well, the best-selling album is still Michael Jackson's Thriller. But if you look at the top 20 best-selling albums, there are more albums from the 70s, but they sold in the 80s. AC/DC's Back in Black, huge. Guns N' Roses, huge. You get everybody in the 80s is buying music. It was a musical decade, and it was the decade of primacy of heavy metal. Heavy metal comes into its own. It steps out of the shadows. It was no longer just one thing. And this is what Martin said, like Black Sabbath is no longer competing against every rock band. Now they're a heavy metal band. And there was so much heavy metal available in the 1980s, and a variety of heavy metal. It starts out very traditional, and then you go through what now we don't even have a term for it, but bands like your early Ozzy and Dio that I think in the 80s, we actually called that power metal for a little bit, but then that term went away, and then it was adopted in Europe for something completely different. But you get speed metal, and you get thrash metal, and you get death metal, and you get black metal, and you get all of these other varieties of metal. There was just heavy metal everywhere. And as a music fan, that was so exciting because in the 70s, you had old hippie bands, Uriah Heep and Black Sabbath and Deep Purple. And then you had Judas Priest. And that was kind of it, right? I mean, you can consider Rainbow Rising to be heavy metal versus hard rock. But there wasn't a lot of things that we call, it's kind of heavy metal-ish in the 70s, or bands like Thin Lizzy. Which is a great band, but it's clearly not a heavy metal band. So if you're a heavy metal fan, the 80s, that's the decade to be a metal fan, is the 1980s. And let's see here. Oh, and I will say this, consider this a plus or not, but the bands from the 70s were still around in the 80s for the most part. They hadn't given it up. Some of them adapted and produced really high-selling music, like Starship or Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac was enormously popular in the 1980s. Some of them tried and didn't do so great, and some of them, like Rush, simply adapted to a completely different thing, and you have new wave Rush, and I know that those albums are controversial among Rush. What do you call Rush aficionados? They have to have a nickname. Anyway, but I love those albums. Those are my favorite albums, are the ones that came out of the 80s, where they've got the newer technology and the newer sound. And yes, they're wearing skinny ties on stage, and I'm sorry that bugs people, but it was the 80s. We wore skinny, well, I didn't wear skinny ties. It was in Montana. We wore flannel. So that's my pitch for the 80s.
Nice. Good job. Wow, we covered a lot of ground with this. This is pretty cool. This was a really good survey of both decades.
All right, and we've gone pretty much an hour, so actually I'm gonna wrap it up there and give myself the benefit of the last word. So that's 3 for the 70s and 2 for the 80s. Everybody, please comment below on which you think is the better decade, the 70s or the 80s. It's the 80s, and let us know why. You can check out Contrarians have t-shirts for sale on TeePublic. Got a Patreon situation. We'd love to have you. It's a great community. And go out and pick your favorite album from the 70s or 80s and give it a spin. We'll see you real soon on another video.
All right. Thanks, guys. See you later.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.